All right. Well, I just want to give a quick introduction of Dr. Sheena Mason. I'm gonna allow her to tell her more about herself, but Sheena and I connected on Twitter. I just began to really follow her work, theory of racelessness that is continuing to grow and develop. And she is working on a new book as well, the Togetherness Wayfinder. And I just want to say personally, I found her work so important to what we're talking about. A lot of times people will look at the word racelessness and they may think we're talking about color blindness. And I don't want to give away what you may talk about, but she's really talking about what we've been saying, that that we dwell above the veil, as Du Bois says, and begin to connect based on our common humanity. That does not mean we don't share our stories or bring our stories in conversation with other people or with the Western or classical tradition, but it means that we value it because it's a human experience. And I'm going to allow her to talk more about that as she shares from her topic called the Togetherness Wayfinder. But Sheena, tell a little bit more about yourself, your background.
Thank you so much, Anika, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to join this rich conversation. I'm an assistant professor in English at SUNY Oneonta, and I specialize in African American, Caribbean, and American literature. My courses are cross-listed with Africana, and Latinx studies at my institution, and I find myself a philosopher of race. I earned my PhD with distinction from Howard University in May 2021. And I am on a mission to share a framework that I've been developing now for about 20 years. I think arguably this journey started for me as an undergraduate when I became obsessed with understanding what this thing called race is. And I saw myself as participating in the efforts that the figures I studied most at that time were participating in, which is striving for human rights, civil rights, and the end of anti-Black racism. So the framework that I've developed, which I'm sharing with you today, um, this is really meant to be an introduction to this framework, but I think it's applicable to our conversation about the classics and how the classics continue to be, I think, framed through particular lenses that are um, oftentimes unhelpful, oftentimes um, skewed, and sometimes wrong or inaccurate and incorrect. This framework is one that anyone can engage in, anyone can look to these kinds of texts to mine for meaning and create more generative spaces for conversations about these kinds of texts and all texts. So while my focus is on um, creating and imagining a future without racism, particularly anti-Black racism, it's relevant wherever we see humans dividing themselves from each other. So let me get into it. Again, this is meant to be an introduction to the theory. During the earlier sessions, the topic of lenses, the topic of frameworks, what I also call toolkits, um, came up. And it's important for me to call out the fact that the Togetherness Wayfinder, formerly called the theory of racelessness, as Anika mentioned, um, is a toolkit. It's a lens, it's a framework, which means that in some ways it's impossible to put all of the meat on the bones in a short introductory presentation, though I will do my best. Um, there are tenets to this Wayfinder, meaning there are rules to the Wayfinder. There are philosophies that underpin it. There are other components of it. Um, there's a language component to this, and all of these things coming together comprise the Wayfinder. So let's start with the tenets then. The rules that underpin and really drive the Wayfinder include the following. First, I define racism, and you can see I spell it differently, as you can see there on the screen. But whether you spell it this way or whether you spell it the traditional way, I'm meaning the same thing. I view these things in the same way. Racism is a socially constructed system of economic and social oppression that often requires the belief in race and the practice of racialization to reinforce various power imbalances. Two, race is an imaginary part of the socially constructed reality of racism. Three, racialization is the process of applying an inescapable economic and social class hierarchy to humans that creates or reinforces power imbalances. Four, the belief in race and practice of racialization affect people differently. These differences serve to uphold the machinery of racism, acting as obstacles to unification, healing, and reconciliation. Five, translation of what one means by race, including the presumed absence of race in any context, can lead to understanding and bridge making. The racelessness translator, which is the primary tool of the theory, helps people interpret race into something being said about the causes and effects of racism itself, or something being said about culture, ethnicity, social class, economic class, or some combination thereof. And six, racism does not exist everywhere in the same way and can be ended. Now let's get into philosophy of race. So in the discipline of philosophy, there are specialists who specialize in analyzing this thing called race across time and across place. And they have come to identify that there are 6 ways that people think about race. 3 of these ways answer the question, what is race? And 3 answer the question, what should we do with it? And even without having the language to articulate, this is my philosophy of race, we each hold 2 of these positions. Now, as it pertains to answering the question, what is race? You could believe that race is hereditary or biological. You could believe that it's synthetic or a construction. And you could believe that it's imaginary or be a full-blown skeptic about race. As it pertains to answering the question, what should we do with race? You could argue that we should preserve race or keep it. We should reform it or reconstruct it, or we should abolish or terminate it. And that's an eliminativist position about race. Now, most of us actually get, I use the word programmed, and I use it very gently. But most of us get socialized. We use the word socialized. We get socialized into 4 of these 6 ways of thinking about what race is and what we should do with it. And we get socialized into thinking about race in these ways through our education system, through our media, through our government. Of course, the government is interconnected with our education system and our media. And now technology is increasingly a part of this socializing process. And the 4 categories of race that we get socialized into include the hereditary and synthetic view of race and the preservationist and reformer view of race. And what's inevitably left out of the conversations, what's left out of classrooms, are the imaginary and terminator or abolitionist view of race, and also the synthetic terminator or synthetic abolitionist view of race. So I invite you to sit for a second and consider which of these views of race do you currently hold, and think a little bit about how you came to that conclusion. And to be clear, you'll pick one from each side of the screen here. And some of the categories might be mutually exclusive. So for example, most people who believe that race is hereditary or biological end up being preservationists about race. In other words, if race is found in nature, then of course what is there to do with it than to keep it? Most people who view race as synthetic or a construction end up being reformers or reconstructionists about race, and for a variety of reasons. And most people who contend that race is completely imaginary end up being abolitionists about race. But you can also contend that race is synthetic and be an abolitionist about race as well. But you couldn't view that race is hereditary and be an abolitionist about it. As you're looking to place yourself, I want to share the philosophies that really underpin the theory. Now, part of what the theory offers is number one, um, teaching people all of the philosophies of race. So all of these philosophies end up being an integral part of this as a toolkit. Um, because currently we get socialized into certain views about race. We do not get taught about philosophy of race. So I think there's an important distinction to make here. And I will say, additionally, as a framework, the framework is its own philosophy of race that is pushing the bounds of what's called skeptical eliminativism, which is the imaginary abolitionist categorization here. So I contend, as evidenced through the tenets, that race is not a social construction, nor is it something found in nature. It's entirely imaginary. And for a variety of reasons, we should abolish it. My reason for abolishing it comes down to the fact that racism itself, that is the socially constructed system of oppression, requires our continued belief in race and practice of assigning race to human beings in order to maintain itself and be sustained. And so, to my mind, to undo racism, we have to undo our belief in race and our practice of racialization. Now, how did I get to these particular philosophies of race, especially considering, like most people, in at least in American society, I grew up as a hereditary believer in race, and therefore I believe that we should keep it. Then I shifted to more of a synthetic view of race as an undergraduate student 20 years ago, and was a reformer, a reconstructionist about race. And then I found myself a synthetic abolitionist, and then finally an imaginary abolitionist. So, how did I get here? Well, people from a variety of political ideologies and educational backgrounds continue to strive to reform the meaning of race and how the belief in race and practice of racialization manifests materially. They often do this by either ignoring or recognizing America's violent history of racism and striving to maintain or remove the violence of racism from what I call racialist ideology. As it pertains to philosophies of race, the default positions continue to be hereditary or synthetic and reformationist or preservationist. Ironically, most colorblind or anti-racist literature and activism today help to uphold racism because they inhabit and promote these positionalities of racialization and belief in race. Most traditionally accepted forms of anti-racism and appeals to colorblindness both hold that race is real, either as a biological fact or human-made phenomenon, and want to refashion the idea of race and practice of racialization, which is the same as trying to reform racism, which means that we will ultimately keep it and its causes and effects. Race, according to philosopher Charles Mills, puts the question of the full humanity of the stigmatized racial groups. When best understood, our imposition and presumption of race result in our sometimes unintentional maintenance of a social and economic hierarchy. Racism as a social construction that necessitates our continued belief in and upholding of racialist ideology and its correlated language and practices helps us to stop misdirecting our focus to race, to the root cause of the belief in race and the practice of assigning race, which is racism itself, the social and economic hierarchies that require these things to operate. Now, we continue to convince ourselves that race is skin color, phenotype, and DNA, inescapable aspects of humanity or ethnicity and culture, also inescapable aspects of humanity that have value. But racism hides behind the illusion of race, which is why misunderstanding race and talking about racism in the language of race contributes to maintaining the causes and effects of racism. Dehumanization is unavoidable whether race is imposed, whenever race is imposed, because race and the assigned or inherited racialization of humans is reflective of the presence of dehumanization in the first place. In the United States, we've been trying to reconstruct the meaning of race since before the American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783. Largely influenced by longstanding and ever-fluid European class systems, race in America once reflected a caste system that included white, black, and brown, indentured servants who, for all intents and purposes, were enslaved, and enslaved indigenous and African people. Further, there were free African or of color, indigenous, and white people. Enslavement was not racialized in the ways many of us currently understand both race and slavery until approximately 1660, when various states began outlawing miscegenation, calculating Blackness, and passing fugitive slave laws. Over time and within the bounds of the peculiar institution of slavery, racialization came to describe the systematic practice of marking out groups of people as the subjects of violence and oppression, supposedly based on ancestry and phenotype, but actually based on the desired social and economic hierarchies. People in the United States continue to try to reconstruct this thing called race to both recognize America's history of racism and to somehow remove the violence of racism from race ideology, which has the effect, of course, of ignoring the origin of said ideology. As it pertains to philosophies of race, the default position has traditionally remained hereditary or synthetic, and reformation or preservation. Paradoxically, most anti-racist discourse and initiatives help reify racism because they inhabit and promote hereditary or synthetic and reformation or preservation positionalities of racialization. In other words, they encourage and privilege the apparition of race and the subsequent practice of racism through racialization. And that is why I argue that we need fresh lenses, frameworks, toolkits to identify and stop the causes and effects of racism. The Togetherness Wayfinder, formerly called the theory of racelessness, offers this to folks through the tenets that I've named, through teaching all philosophies of race, and also emphasizing and pushing the bounds of skeptical eliminativism through language. So you notice when I talk about racism, I'll say something like a person who gets racialized as white, or a person who gets racialized as Asian or Black, or fill in the blank. So I'm centering the humanity of the person first, and then I'm indicating that something external, not, this is not a question of essence. This is not a question of what is inside of us or what we are born with. Something externally happens in the context of our societies that imposes this thing called race onto any and all of us. So even just making that shift and working with students, me in university, but I've also done this work with 9th to 12th graders, has a significant difference and impact into how people receive the information that's being presented, and how people see themselves in relation to and with other people. Also, spelling racism with the word race in it. This is not something that translates ideally into the audible form of saying the word racism because it sounds the same. sometimes I try to be dramatic and I'll say racism. Uh, so I'll try to emphasize that I'm doing something different here with language. But at least in written form, the sign has a certain impact. Similarly, I use words like racialist as written there on the screen. Um, I also use the word erasure, but I put the word race in there to signal that if people are being racialized, there is a type of erasure that's happening there. Erasure about how we see ourselves culturally, ethnically, humanly. Our humanness is called into question with the imposition of race. So all of this language gets carried through the framework and as a tool, as part of the toolkit. Also, I theorize conceptualizations of what I call the walking negative, rememory, maternal energy, invisible ink, twilight, madness, consolation, nation, diaspora, and home. And all of these parts of the theory stem from a lot of the writers that I've taken the most sustenance and substance from, like Toni Morrison with Rememory, also Toni Morrison with Invisible Ink. Um, uh, when I think about something like Twilight, I think of Anna Devere Smith. Um, Also, Madness came through reading her one woman play, which was a set of interviews that she did after the Rodney King riots in California. Um, and all of all of my studies that I've done over the 20 years have brought me to the conceptualizing of the togetherness wayfinder. And these different writers have just helped me find language to describe what I was observing through my study of liberation movements, through my study of these human rights movements and efforts. And therefore, they're part and parcel of the togetherness wayfinder. Also, the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is rooted in African philosophy, where there are many different terms that describe the same thing, but the idea behind it is that I am because we are, right? It's a way of thinking about our humanity, about thinking about our humanness that de-emphasizes hyper individuality but recognizes while also still recognizing the place of the individual in the broader context of community. Um, it strikes me that our black and white, pun intended, way of thinking about race in places like the United States actually prevents and precludes many of us from recognizing that wherever there's a binary, both sides of the binary are parts of our shared reality, right? So, um, in in other words, we tend to think in terms of community or individual, right? And depending on who you ask, uh, we might have preferences for one side of the binary over the other, but both sides of the binary are in fact part of our humanness, part of the human story. And so the work of this Togetherness Wayfinder is to help more people understand how we come to these things called binaries, and why it's important to explode these binaries in favor of recognizing the true complexity of what life is. This also means that within the context of the United States, the information that comes with and part and parcel of the Wayfinder includes some of the history that I've outlined, right? This that the very invention of the apparition or the illusion of race is rooted in a particular history in the American context. But remember that one of the tenets of the theory is that racism doesn't exist everywhere in the same way. So if I go to a different place and if I go to a different time, what is too often the case up until now is I'm taking my particular worldview and lens and I'm looking elsewhere and I'm applying it, right? And so we use language like uh, the authors of the classics, these people don't look like us, right? Or it's white. I remember Anika was using that kind of language earlier to describe some of the pushback that she hears. Um, so we use that language because we're operating from the black and white paradigm that we are socialized within. So what does it look like to be able to step outside of, even if just temporarily, even if just in the space of a classroom, step outside of that paradigm to truly grapple with the reality of what's happening on the ground during the time of the text that in the writers that we're studying? This strikes me as one of the critical um, benefits of using something like the Togetherness Wayfinder, because people are better equipped to do that, but they have to first have the door open to step outside of themselves in a way, step outside of their belief system to really question everything, and again explode the boundaries, seeing in the particular the universal, and seeing in the universal the particular, etc. All of these things are necessary components of the wayfinder for reasons that have been clearly, I think, articulated in the earlier sessions. But if we take the rules of the theory, the tools of the theory, like the racelessness translator, which I'm going to mention more in a second, the philosophies of race, if we take that and we examine other places and other times, too, the part that would change inevitably is going to be the information part, the historical part, right? Because every nation doesn't have the same history, and even within a single nation, different regions, different zip codes, different towns, different cities, etc., and different states all have different histories as well. So it's important to keep that in mind and consider this an invitation for anyone interested in doing this type of work to mine for meaning in other places and times using some of the tools of the theory. Now, earlier I mentioned that one of the primary tools of the theory is what I call the race translator in my first book, but what I call the racelessness translator in my forthcoming book, The Raceless Anti-Racist. So the racelessness translator, the best way to think about it is it's an analytical tool that helps folks translate what presents as race or racial into racism itself, either the causes and effects, culture, ethnicity, social class, or economic class. Imagine, if you will, that we are in an episode of Scooby-Doo and we're chasing after the villain, and the villain is wearing the literal colors black and white split down the middle, right, and a shirt that says race. So we capture the villain and we demask the villain, which happens in virtually every Scooby-Doo episode, and all of a sudden race shapeshifts into these five other entities. Our ability to translate race language into these other categories helps us to be infinitely more clear-eyed about scientific reality. It helps us be infinitely more clear-eyed about uh, things that have value, such as culture. It helps us be more clear-eyed about racism itself. And this is just something that in an effort to truly question everything and to create context and cultures, especially in classrooms, that empower folks to really question everything. This process of translation might seem very straightforward, but in some ways is probably one of the hardest things for people to do, because we get socialized and deeply entrenched in these black and white views of seeing ourselves and other people, which also means that when we're able to successfully change our own minds and reroute some things, we benefit that much more from it. And I can say with sincerity that my students have never looked at me and said, Dr. Mace, I regret learning any of the things that I learned in your class. I regret doing the hard work. And they call it emotional, spiritual, and intellectual work, and it is, but it is so worth it. I also want to mention too that part of the translation comes down to being able to identify and truly articulate and understand philosophies of race as they play out on X, formerly Twitter, right? As they play out on TikTok, as they show up in news media, as they show up in history books, as they show up in literature, right? What philosophies of race are being communicated through these various mediums and texts, and why, right? And what do you think the character, what do you think the writer are trying to communicate about what we should do with race? What do you think, which might be different from what's being communicated here? All of these parts of translation are part of the Wayfinder. Now, what does any of this mean? And what are the potential impacts? As I see it, if we recognize the root of what racism is, then the question becomes, what do we do with it? And I hear a fair number of folks tell me that it's impossible to stop racism, it's impossible to end it, it's impossible to change our society because this is how it is, it's been this way for a long time. But I would argue, especially in the context of us talking about the classics, which go back to way before the Middle Passage, right? That human history doesn't start with the Middle Passage or that point of contact. Um, and if we can think about the entirety of the human story, then we might consider the fact that what we call race and how many of us experience racism in the context of a place like the United States is actually very young compared to the entirety of humanity, which can give us some hope in thinking about considering the possibility and probability that indeed the world is always and ever changing and it needn't stay exactly the same just because we recognize it's hard to change it, right? um so a couple of things about colorblindness too, because I know Anika mentioned this in the introduction as being distinct from colorblindness, but that sometimes people hear something like the theory of racelessness and they imagine that I'm saying some kind of colorblind thing, for better, worse, or indifferent. So, as I understand color blindness, it's this in good faith, it's this idea that I can see you, I can recognize something about you that I translate and describe as race and interracial language, but that I don't allow my recognition of your so-called race to impact how I treat you, right? And many of us know that there are limitations to color blindness in practice. In theory, it sounds great, right? It's the Martin Luther King Jr. dream of being judged by the content of one's character and not by the color of one's skin, as he says. But in practice, this falls apart because fundamentally, where there's a belief in race, as I said earlier, there is a dehumanization that's happening. And that dehumanization gets carried through the imposition of race, gets carried through the language of race. So even though it might seem innocuous to say that, oh, I can see a person, I can see their skin complexion, I can know that a person is white, or I can know a person is black, etc. And I can still treat that person fairly. Again, in theory, that's good and well, but because that translation of race and the belief in race are still there and part and parcel of the colorblind ideology, that's why we see in practice it has its limitations, right? And on the other side of the same coin, more explicitly race ideological views are still, again, operating and upholding this belief in race as something somehow separate and distinct from racism, oftentimes as part of racism, but also as something beneficial. That helps to maintain the problems in the same way that colorblindness does, because where there's the belief in a race and practice of racialization, the dehumanizing apparatus that reflects maintains. So we needed new frames and new ways of seeing ourselves and each other in order to really get to the root of what racism is, to better understand what it isn't, and to open the door to new pathways. I'm optimistic about the future. I consider myself an Afrofuturist, and that means that I'm obsessed and concerned with all things liberation. And as I see it, we have nothing to lose by engaging with something like the Togetherness Wayfinder, by um, experimenting with it in classrooms and the like, because at the end of the day, what we've been doing and what we've been trying, it hasn't worked. In case anyone has noticed, looking out into the public domain as we speak, uh, what we've tried, it hasn't worked. So, what would it look like to try something entirely new that's not maintaining or part of the status quo, that helps us get outside of the matrix? Or I like to use a fishbowl analogy, right? Like right now, imagine we're all living in a fishbowl because of how we get socialized. Um, and imagine now that you find yourself one day outside of the fishbowl and you realize you didn't actually need to be in water to breathe, right? And actually, you're not even still in water outside of the fishbowl, you're in outer space. And it's much more expansive out here, potentially terrifying. Uh, but yet you find yourself outside of the fishbowl. Now you can be clear eyed about what the fishbowl is, what it comprises of, what its parameters are. And you can do that with language and rules and tools that help you not to maintain the perceived reality or necessity of this fishbowl, right? And then you have an option. Do you want to be in the fishbowl still, or do you not want to be in the fishbowl still? And if you don't want to be in the fishbowl, how do you want to help other people get out of the fishbowl? These are the possibilities, and that the theory offers to create pathways to a better future. Now, with this very brief introduction and overview of what the Togetherness Wayfinder is, I invite you to check out my forthcoming book. It is a book for a broad audience, so this is not a scholarly text, though there's certainly scholarship in there. It's called The Raceless Anti-Racist: Why Ending Race is the Future of Anti-Racism. And for the first time in a comprehensive manner, I'm presenting this framework for any and all interested parties. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time and attention and open up the floor for questions and conversation.
I just thank you so much, Sheena. That phrase you said, human history does not start with the Middle Passage. Like, whoo, I had to sit with that for a minute. I think we all tend to be stuck at that moment. And it's like that's the dot going forward, as opposed to maybe seeing human history like a circle that's just continuous. And yeah, I love the concept of, because we have really racialized the classical tradition. We've made it definitely part of some type of racial construct. I did when I first came to it. I came to it very late in my life, in my 30s. And I came to it seeing it through a racial lens. And then as I got involved, that began to dissipate. So I just really am just thankful for how your work is inviting us to look at something like this and other aspects of human life and history through a completely, like, outside of the matrix, as you said. I don't know, I forgot to turn my camera on. I'm going to see if we have some questions. Sheena has put her link to her book in the chat. And then I'm going to see if we have some questions. And you can also feel free to ask any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And I'll give people a second. And Sheena, if you have anything extra you'd like to share, I think I've been getting text messages. I think people are just really processing what you're saying. It's such a new way of thinking about everything. That being said, I have a question though. So the way you are talking about this, I'm very new to this too. I feel almost afraid to even speak on your theory because it's so outside of the way I have navigated life. So I'm in the process myself of retraining my thinking. Um, what are some of the um, what are some of the resistance you receive when you first present this to others?
It's interesting because I feel like when I'm actually able to present it to folks, the resistance I get with before a person even engages, like for instance, if they just hear the theory of racelessness, they tell themselves a story about what I'm communicating, and without reading even a tweet, you know, a short article, definitely not reading my book, not listening to a podcast, which I have all these things out into the world, right? Without any of that, I'll get that's where I think the most resistance tends to come. And the resistance tends to be from folks who imagine that I am perpetrating some kind of like color blindness, and who view the limitations and the problems of color blindness as problematic, and rightly so. And so therefore the resistance comes from that kind of positionality. But for folks who actually come into a space with me in some way and um, hear more about what I have to say, the resistance tends to look a little different. Sometimes there might still be concern that it's like color blindness, right? But more often than not, I feel like people just say or think, it's not practical to change society in the way that I'm advocating for. And well, my response to that, and I get this a lot from undergraduate students too, right? Like, yeah, this is great. I'm all in. I'm persuaded by the evidence you've presented, but it's not practical because if you think about it, our belief in race and our practice of racialization is so ingrained and infused into virtually every aspect and facet of our society. So it does seem like I'm just romanticizing some or entertaining some utopic notion of like what things could be. But was it Einstein who said something to the effect of how the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? What I tell my students is it's actually the opposite. It's actually impractical to think that to end racism or to meaningfully address racism, we can keep doing the thing we've done for centuries now and keep expecting a different result, all while scratching our heads oftentimes, looking in the public domain and seeing what's happening, right, in the cultural and political spheres. Um, that to me is a definition of madness. That to me is impractical, right? As evidenced by the literal history of trying to do this work and trying to advance the cause of ending and resisting racism in the same way, from the same philosophies, from the same kind of rules and tools. That to me is madness. So when I put it that way, I do get some more aha moments from folks like, oh, okay, when you put it that way, yeah, it does seem a little strange. And then the last thing I'll say too is I think that white supremacy would have us believe intentionally that it's inevitable, that it is permanent, that it is inescapable. And to that, I would say it absolutely is inescapable if we are still operating within its paradigm, right? Um, but then the question becomes, why are we still operating in this paradigm? Audre Lorde said the masters can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Like there's some truth to that, right? Not always, but certainly some. In this instance, yes. So this is me opening the door and sending out an invitation to folks to consider maybe how we've been thinking about this, we've got it wrong, and here's why. And as important, here's what we can do instead. Oh, you're muted.
Ooh. I feel like when I when I think about it and try to have this conversation about your work with others on all sides, it's so out of the box, and it also dismantles our daily existence. It's beyond just changing our mindset. Like, so much would change. Uh, Economically, the books that are written, the classes that are taught, it would have this domino effects, that I feel like when people start thinking about it, it becomes almost overwhelming. And then we tend to want to continue the insanity because the work it takes to change this mindset has such a pervasive domino effect. And in fact, India has a question because um she says, let's see, she says, hold on. Great talk, Sheena. I'm curious to learn more about this idea and wondering, in the effort of making this utopia a reality, what would be a practical first step in achieving a raceless society? Do we start with our schools, our government, or somewhere else? As you said, it is so deeply infused in every corner of our society. How do we begin to extricate? And I think it's maybe a
Yes,
question
thank
like,
you,
how do we
Diana,
just
for
do
your
this?
comment too, and
Yeah,
thank you, India, for your
yes.
comment and question.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
This is a great place to end. I know we're at time. So I feel like this is the answer that that some people aren't anticipating, but my response is start with yourself. You have to actually engage with the theory, the framework, the wayfinder, all of it, and do the work within yourself, which is where I think liberation actually starts. And where I think people devalue the benefits of freeing oneself from this way of thinking. As Anika was saying earlier in her experiences with racism, um, and the kinds of impacts that that had on her when she went into different spaces at first and such, she was able to work through those kinds of moments. But on a fundamental level, racism, though structural, impacts us as individuals too, right? And so with the individual, with yourself, is where I think this work really needs to start. Um, and then once you've experienced some of the benefits of this mind shift or the paradigm shift, then I think we definitely need to go to K-12 for sure, because us adults, we have more work to do because we've been socialized a particular way. But if we get it right with our kids and we don't put them in the fishbowl in the first place, and instead we give them the tools to help them analyze the fishbowl, that's going to be the game changer for them, right? So I think K-12 education is really a critical space for this kind of paradigm shift. Thank you, and thank you, Anika, for having me again. I
Tina,
appreciate you.
I'm so thankful that you could do this because your work, I wanted to kind of really be foundational to what I'm trying to do, just creating this new world. And so I want to thank you for having the bravery to do something like this. This video will be on our YouTube channel at Redefining Classics on YouTube. These videos from today's event will be uploaded on our YouTube channel probably within a week. It'll take that time to turn it all around. They're not going to be fancy. I'm not getting them edited. I'm uploading them straight from my computer. They've just been really phenomenal. So I'm so thankful for all the speakers we've had. I thought it was important for us to start off this work with a theory. You know, there's so many different theories out there, and it was important for everyone to understand my heart in this work. This is not a divisive work, a political work, a work that would cause us to become embattled against one another. I wanted to find something that was very unifying, that we can just really read and understand this framework, this foundation that we're coming from. So I'm so thankful for Sheena's work, for providing that framework, that theoretical framework for us. I'm going to stop the video here and get ready for our next guest.